after looking at families over the last, I don't know, 3 decades, clearly, the modern family in the 21st century is becoming increasingly complex and fluid. And I don't like to think about families as, their structure, but about what they do, about the sorts of things. And some modern families, like the whole surrogacy thing, it can be a head spin to try to work out relationships and responsibilities.
Hello and welcome to Idioms of Normality. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Mason, and this series is hosted on Future Frame TV, the collective podcast series of Traces&Dreams. And I'm joined today by Professor Bruce Smyth from the Australian National University. Welcome.
Thanks for having me, Paul.
And thanks for being prepared to tackle the question of normality. And tell me, what perspectives and experiences do you bring to this question?
Yeah, I reckon you've come to the wrong place to ask me this question, but I'm going to have a crack anyway. I should say I was born in London to an American dad and have lived in Australia for much of my life. So there's a bit of British in me, a bit of American, and a lot of Aussie and a few other things. And I know as an anthropologist, culture is something that you're pretty interested in. So I'm a family sociologist, and I love families. Families have been said to be the great shock absorber and the great shock provider. And, they bring incredible amounts of joy and pain into our lives. And, when I meet people, including someone like yourself, I feel like much of who we are as individuals can be traced back to our family, especially in our formative years, So I'm not asking you to tell me about your family, but if you did, that would give me a pretty good sense around how you interact in the world, how you interact with others, how resilient you are, and a host of other things. So I'm a social scientist who's worked in family law for the last 3 decades. I look at the impact of divorce on children. My first career was as a professional drummer in Melbourne, so I toured with Bo Diddley from America, was on Countdown, did a host of other things, did that for 10 years. The backside fell out of music, and so I went and did a degree in psych and sociology. After 3 years, with a bit of a break, jumped into a PhD, which I suspect is not normal to go from a 3-year degree into a PhD without honours or masters. And I'd like to talk to you about creative disruption today. That's kind of where I'm heading with what is normal. Yep. So, I worked at a research institute called the Australian Institute of Family Studies for a decade and then moved up to ANU. So I think what I'm saying, mate, is spending 10 years behind a drum kit, touring with people, you see the world in a very different way. And so what is normal, is clearly very context dependent. But I know you're going to ask more about that. So I think what I'm saying is I haven't had a normal kind of trajectory in my research career, but it's allowed me to see things afresh and not be stuck in traditional paradigms where you tend to have a lens that looks a certain way at everything.
I love so much about this, and it's exactly you're exactly the kind of person I love having on this kind of show, with diverse background, no normal career trajectory, and you're a man after my own heart with the Essendon Bombers hat on, of course.
Well, you know that joke, who do you barrack for? Anyone who plays against Collingwood.
ABC, yeah. Anything but Collingwood. I think we just lost all our Collingwood viewers.
Probably. Sorry about that, guys.
That's a bit of Australian humour for anyone watching from abroad. Australian rules football is something that Melburnians and other people around Australia take very seriously, but particularly Melburnians. And I think Bombers fans have had a bit rough over the last decade, but we're hanging in. So let me head in with the big question then. Professor Smyth, what is normal?
Well, as I said, it's something that's very subjective and context dependent. I'd like to detour straight away, Paul. This will be quite an unconventional interview, I suspect, because I've been following, probably like you and all your colleagues, this whole thing around Chat GPT. Because it's shaking up academia and shaking up the world in lots of ways. I'm fascinated because later on I'd like to talk about technologically fueled abuse and the potential role of AI. that's kind of where I'd like to go. But I couldn't help but type in the question, what is normal, this morning, just to see what it would spit out. And what's so interesting is that when it spits something back, you can actually improve the data. So, if you played with that, I reckon you'd be able to certainly improve the quality of.
I've interviewed AI about, just in my own time with the question, what is normal, and pursued it from various directions and had a great interview. And I've been wondering, how can I turn that into an episode in and of itself? I even put into ChatGPT, you're going to have a laugh here. Tell me about Bruce Smyth and his research. And it gave me a great summary of you.
Imposter, fake.
No, it gave me a great summary of your family research, your research on separated co-parents, and it was a beautiful summary. I'll send it to you.
Okay. Yeah. That's great. I'll be able to just put it on my ANU bio.
Awesome. Yeah, perfect. Actually, that's the perfect use of ChatGPT, because as an academic, you're asked to write about yourself so much, and it can be a bit tiring constantly writing about yourself. And I think this sort of fuels what you're saying about imposter syndrome.
Yeah, and what I like about it is you can improve the quality of data, but actually you can hit the regenerate button, and it'll change the definition of what is normal, or Paul Mason that. So you can keep on regenerating, and because it's just statistical associations with words, it's kind of pretty interesting.
So I didn't need to do over 50 episodes on what is normal. I could have just hit the regenerate button on ChatGPT 50 times.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, you've ruined my series.
So, mate, before we get into kind of my response to what is normal, I actually want to flick this onto you, because you bring a lot to this conversation. And I've watched about 15 episodes, and I'm really enjoying the series. Sort of a dozen at the front end and a couple at the tail end, and I will get to everyone in the middle. But I just want to ask you 3 quick questions, because I'm sort of fascinated. And that is, why ask the question, what is normal? And I know your background's in anthropology. Why run a series on what is normal, which is kind of really interesting, what the catalyst was. And after 50 episodes, what have you learned about this?
The thing I like about the question of normality is that it cuts across so many disciplines. And I've tried to capture a set of interviewees that are quite diverse. So I've got perspectives from men, women, feminists, scientists, field workers, artists, musicians, actors. I'm hoping to line up a conductor composer in the next few weeks. And it's been an interesting learning trajectory. And forgive me for saying this, and maybe this might actually sort of speak to some of the hesitancy you have in tackling the question head on, is that I think one thing I've learned is just how bad we are at answering the question, what is normal? And I say that not to do any disservice to anyone who's been an interviewee, but to recognize how much the myth of normality has infiltrated almost every discipline of human endeavor, and how it trips us all up in so many different disciplines, whether it's law, commerce, science, medicine, sociology, anthropology. We might have a very articulate philosophical answer to the question of what is normal, and then we go off and we go to the supermarket and we pursue normality in our purchases, in our behaviors in public. We display normality for others so that others feel safe around us. And so as much as you can dismantle the concept, we simultaneously still subscribe to it. And so finding subtle ways to challenge normality is one of the impetuses for, do you say impeti? Impetuses for this research. And I think also toying with dismantling normality is hopefully giving people a little bit of permission to not be so hard on themselves. Because trying to be normal is hard. It's especially, it's really interesting talking with some people who have visible and invisible handicaps or disabilities. They talk about displaying normality can be really challenging, really hard work, and it puts more pressure on certain groups of people to go the distance of making themselves look the normal, which is very controlled by a white heteronormative discourse. That was your first question, yeah?
Yeah, and you've kind of moved into why the series. Can I just jump in with a quick anecdote just so you can have some time to think? When I first started watching the series, a story came to mind, which was, a musician story. In Sydney, there's a great jazz band, and I know a trombone player in Melbourne whose brother has schizophrenia and plays in this jazz band as a bass player. And, it'd be Saturday afternoon, they'd have a packed house where they were playing. And suddenly the bass player with schizophrenia would have a psychotic episode, and he'd walk away and go off and play a completely random, different, absurd tune. The rest of the band, who are jazz musicians, would look at each other and smile and go, "This is great. Let's go with him," And so the abnormal becomes kind of the normal currency in jazz, So again, this creative disruption. Yeah.
I like it. I want to find out more about creative disruption, and I also want to flag that one of the reasons I think you're really interesting to have on the series is because there's so much normativity about what it is to be a family and what it means to have a family, be in a family, and operate as a family, particularly under nationalist discourse, under marketing, but also just through kinship networks as well. And which stream should we go down first? Creative disruption, or can I ask you questions on normality in the family?
How about we just tie you off and tell me what you've learned after 49 episodes?
What have I learned? I've learned a lot in the sense that, normal can become its own beast in any particular endeavor. One of the things that comes to my mind is sort of paraphrasing, combining 2 or 3 interviews and paraphrasing them as the following. I think normality is the position that doesn't need to justify itself. And that's not the only answer to the question, because the answer to the question depends on which way you want to take the discussion. But I particularly like that answer because if you need to, and I'm going to link it to your research a little bit, if you need to justify yourself as a male co-parent, or if you need to justify yourself because you're not a nuclear family, or if you need to justify yourself because you're not the normal, there's more effort that you need to put in. There's more cognitive effort. If you need to justify why your narrative, why your CV doesn't look like other people's, you have to do more work than the person who appears normal and subscribes to the dominant discourse in the way they've been able to pigeonhole themselves. But also, I think there's a disservice there to the person who appears normal on the surface, but may not necessarily feel normal on the inside. And that disservice is by revisiting the basic question, what is normal, we can actually point out that there is no normal. And even though this person that we're pigeonholing, we're actually doing them a disservice because we're glossing over who they might be on the inside because we're making judgments about them based on appearance, behavior, commodities, CV, or whatever. Can we use that as a segue into the family?
Yeah, we can.
Research?
Yeah. And mate, I'm not trying to deflect to you. I'm just trying to build some rapport so I kind of know where they're headed, because good interviews are about respectful relationships.
Absolutely.
So it's been really helpful. Thank you so much for sharing that. So obviously what is normal is context dependent. After looking at families over the last, 3 decades, clearly, the modern family in the 21st century is becoming increasingly complex and fluid. And I don't like to think about families as, their structure, but about what they do, about the sorts of things. And some modern families, like the whole surrogacy thing, it can be a head spin to try to work out relationships and responsibilities and so on. So today, I'd like to talk about a couple of things like about normal conflict, about normal parenting arrangements after separation, or normal patterns of communication coming out of a couple of recent studies. And maybe I could start with normal conflict. So we know when parents separate, for the first year or two, there's actually a fair bit of conflict. I mean, a lot of families get along, but conflict is kind of normal because usually one person has made the call. Typically about 78-80% of women make that call initially, for a whole host of reasons. Men can't hear, or dads can't hear, and all of a sudden, where did that come from? What happened? And that conflict hangs around, but I'm kind of really interested in more intense, like the darker side of families and family relationships. And so I've been playing around with this notion of interparental hatred. And it's funny, when you're in America and presenting and people hear you talking about hatred, they won't even say the word hate. They'll talk about the H word. And, as kids, we, we're kind of normalized to not talk about hating someone. But actually, I think when you talk with families at the really extreme level of conflict, you kind of move into something else. And so I've suggested with a colleague that this is entrenched interparental hatred. And then you go, well, what's that about? And what we know is that often hatred is a way of staying connected to someone. It's a proximity behavior. Because to lose them can be losing yourself and losing your identity. And so, we pay a great price when we hate others. It comes at a great cost to ourselves because we're doing a lot of hate work to hold on to that connection. And so I've been looking at ways of how you can get people back from hatred to normal, good old high conflict, where high conflict becomes normal rather than just getting along.
Yeah, interesting. It's funny that there's this phrase, normal conflict, in your field. Like it's an interesting phrase. And the idea of hatred is an interesting one too, because I've heard in the corridors of anthropology departments and neighboring departments where they have a tough time with the word love. Because it's subjective, it's difficult to quantify, it's difficult to really ground down. And here I'm hearing the flip side, which is it's difficult to talk about hate, but more so because there's reaction against using the word altogether, because it's abhorrent to use the word. It's, I remember my kids coming home from school and one of them said, I hate this. And then the other one said, oh, Dad, he said the H word. And I was like, what? I didn't know that you weren't allowed to say the H word. Like,
yes. So let's move into creative disruption. So,
okay.
The question I kind of wanted to ask you, I kind of wanted to move away from the question, what is normal? Because you've done that for 48, 49 episodes now. I'm curious to ask the question, when is being normal useful and when is it not useful? And when is being abnormal useful? What do you think of that question?
Oh, interesting. Yeah. I'm trying to think of it in the context of what you were just saying. And, it's, in the context of post-separation conflict, appearing to be the normal parent can give you some social kudos. And also, I think there's a desire, I'd imagine there's a desire, and you're more familiar with the research, of course, so I'm just throwing it out there as an idea. I'd imagine there's a desire to maintain some level of normalcy for the children. I think Brad Pitt, in the midst of his breakup, said, "Our lives are their normal." Talking about their kids, so the lives that they had was their kids' normal, and so the normal that the kids grow up with could be a high conflict post-separation environment, could be a high conflict marriage environment, and yet on the desire to exhibit normalcy can sometimes actually possibly even work to stop addressing those issues. But I think we can sort of take an Irving Goffman take on it about the performativity of normal, and that we put on our normal when we walk out the house. Like I'm actually wearing this hat, for example, because I didn't bother to brush my hair. So I thought, well, I don't want people being distracted by my hair. And so sometimes we perform normal because we don't want people to be distracted by our green toenails. and sometimes we perform normal because we want to endear ourselves to others. And sometimes we perform abnormal because we want attention. Perhaps we will perform abnormal depending on context, right?
Yeah.
What do those questions do for you? There's a new direction there that's helpful, right?
Yeah. So people and parents get stuck. They get stuck in ways that become normal, where hatred can become normal, and where I'm the better parent than you, so therefore I should have the kids, that kind of stuff. So when people get stuck, I wonder whether creative disruption as an approach or some kind of intervention is helpful. By the way, I wish Donald Trump was a mediator, because I think he's one of the greatest creative disruptors in the world. Like, I think if you've got two parents flying around the planet with their kids, and you're trying to knock one of them out of the orbit to get some kind of change, I reckon Trump would be, I don't know what would be left of the whole bloody family situation, but you'd certainly get some creative disruption going on there, So I just think this idea around how do you, can abnormal actually be quite beneficial and productive in some circumstances, such as sitting behind a drum kit for 10 years and then moving into academia and seeing things differently.
I mean, there's a lot of cross-training there as well, right? And I like this. I'm jumping between a few things you said. I really like the metaphor of knocking someone out of their orbit, because if they're enjoying orbiting around a set of patterns, and this is what I like about the question of what is normal. It's about identifying the patterns and then maybe unpacking them. I'm not necessarily pushing for abnormality and saying that we need to be. I don't think abnormality is the solution to getting rid of people's addiction to normality, but I do like the idea of knocking people out of their orbit just so they can, experience the world from a different perspective for a moment, and perhaps click refresh on their behaviors. How would that look? What would that? It's the first time I see what you're saying. It's the first time I've heard someone say something constructive about Trump, but I can see what you're saying. That kind of really jarring pattern of disrupting someone's rhythm, because sometimes, and I've seen how he does it in debates too, like he just doesn't answer the question and then deflects and introduces, a lot of a gish gallop too, just throws in there a lot of falsehoods that are very difficult to remedy, but in doing so does push people out of their orbit a little bit to sort of get them outside of their comfort zone. How does hatred become a comfort zone?
Because if our relationships are central to who we are and others are a big part of who we are, the loss of that can be shattering. And so to stay in that comfort zone, you want to hold on to a connection. And when someone says, I don't love you anymore, or I found someone else, it's kind of like, what do you do? You could say, okay, your heart's not in it. I get it, I'll move along. But unfortunately, a lot of people aren't able to have that degree of kind of maturity or reflection. And so want to hold on, which is why you get these high rates of stalking, of family violence, other means of coercive control to try to keep people close. If
I remember correctly, 4 out of 5 relationships end because the woman decides that the relationship will end. Does that mean that women are better equipped to change orbit, or women are better equipped to move on from a relationship that's perhaps moving into not a healthy territory?
I think, I don't want to be too gendered, because it cuts both ways, of course. And, good behavior and bad behavior isn't gendered. But I think for a lot of women, they try to tell their partners, hey, there's some things going on here. Can we work it through? And unfortunately for some men, they just want to keep on saying, yeah, okay, and can't hear. the discussion around relationships, and so bed down into, bunker down, and then all of a sudden they're wondering why it's a bit late. So I think if you ask women who initiate separation, is this what you wanted? Most would say no.
Yeah, I like how you said that. I don't want to create a discussion that is too gendered, and particularly in the context of a country like Australia that recognises that love is love. These discussions of post-separation conflict become much more nuanced when it's when you're accommodating for the whole spectrum of different kinds of relationships that people can have. But it's interesting, though, that when you look at Australian law, or at least government regulations, that they still remain quite gendered. When we talk about regular care for parents, for example, like regular care for a father, for a separated male co-parent, is 127 days a year. That's 52 weekends, annual leave, and public holidays, and that's not 50% of the year. That's just perpetuating the male breadwinner model. So it's a very gendered environment within which that sort of normalizes certain patterns of behavior between male and female co-parents, which is not keeping with the times, is it?
No. So one of the things, years ago, I was pretty interested in what's the normal parenting arrangement after separation. And everyone says every other weekend and half school holidays. But there were, I'd never seen any data on this. It was kind of like a myth of the normal pattern, and everyone kind of went with it. And so I collected a whole bunch of data, and lo and behold, even though you could see that every other weekend, which is a kind of 50-50 when you think about it, because through the week the kids are busy with school and so on and homework and other things, but the weekends are free time, leisure time. So if you alternate every other weekend, you'll sort of have a pseudo 50-50. But actually, that's not bringing both parents into the mix around the activities around their kids, around caring. And so one of the things I've been pushing hard for a long time is looking at other ways of caring for children. So it doesn't have to be 50-50. There's all sorts of patterns of care that families are doing. And, I remember asking someone, why do you do your 50-50 starting on a Tuesday night? And they said, oh, that's simple. That's tight ass Tuesday. You get cheap meals on Tuesday night.
I love it.
People have all sorts of reasons for the patterns for care, but I'd like to encourage people to think really carefully around what their kids need. What are the anchor points in everyone's lives? How can you make this work for kids and for parents? And to move away from these binaries of basically, there are over 1 million children in Australia who have a parent living elsewhere. Around a quarter never see that parent, typically dad. That's a huge kind of social problem. It's almost normal for father absence to occur. Wow. And that's true in most Western societies. And yet in Australia, our response has been to go, okay, well, let's go to the other extreme bookend and go 50-50, which for many families actually can't work for logistical reasons or financial reasons and so on.
Yeah.
So, like what is normal around care? Well, it's all up for grabs. And that's the great thing about contemporary society, really.
And yet norms very heavily influence what happens in places like the family law or federal court, circuit court, or when lawyers and judges get involved, there are certain norms that they'll adhere to, which are norms that have arisen within a particular gendered environment. And so I guess it's interesting, the creative disruption that you're driving for, I can see, is much more focused on the idiosyncrasies of each family. What are the anchor points? Is a lovely question that works best for the children and also puts the parents in the best place to provide the best care for those children in those circumstances.
Yeah.
Let me throw you another statistic that I thought was really intriguing. So apparently over the last 16, 17 or 18 years, overall rates of violence in Australia have been dropping. But I saw a report from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare saying that over the last 16, 17 or 18 years, I say 16, 17 or 18 because I saw this report 2 years ago and I revisited it again and it just had the same data again. So I'm confused why the data hasn't changed for 2 years. But so overall rates of violence are dropping in Australia, but intimate partner violence has remained stable. So why are we not seeing a reduction in intimate partner violence when overall rates of violence are dropping in the country?
Mm.
Is it?
When you say overall rates, because there's a whole definitional world
Mm,
around, what is violence, what
yeah,
is
yeah.
normal, what is love, what is violence. And I'd be interested to see how that phrase is defined in those two bits of data you're talking about.
I think that's a really interesting point, because I think one of the difficulties that I've observed in looking at this data is that some of the easiest data to collect is data on physical violence. If there's been physical violence, that's a very easy capture point for data. But things like financial abuse, which
Yeah.
is violence, is harder to collect. Emotional abuse is also very difficult to not just capture, but also to prove for one parent or the other to prove. Neglect, if it was, which is a form of emotional abuse. There's forms of violence which, to your point, are very difficult to collect. I think this was talking about physical violence, but I don't want to
Yeah.
speak on behalf of the AIHW. I just thought it was really interesting that
Yeah.
they were finding that intimate partner violence was not declining, even though using the same measure for overall, for whatever they were defining as violence, was dropping on a country level.
And mate, I do wonder if we're getting anywhere on the whole family violence and abuse stuff. Like a lot of money is being thrown out at the moment, and still each day you read the news and you just look at these horrific, outcomes and events. And mate, that's certainly for another episode.
I find it interesting because I live in the central coast of New South Wales, and I learned recently that the highest rates of intimate partner violence are in the Lakes District, this area of Australia. The highest rates of intimate partner violence are in this area. And the person who alerted me to this was actually a barista at a local cafe. And then I was chatting to a police officer a week or two later, and I said, "Oh, is it true that this area has the highest rates of intimate partner violence?" And he goes, "You mean domestic violence?" I said, "Yes." and he said, "Yeah, we need more police to manage this. We don't have enough police." And it's just so funny that its immediate go-to was, "We need more police to solve this." And I'm just not convinced that I think what these statistics suggest is perhaps that the methods that we are using to address this problem are possibly, and it's an uncomfortable question, are possibly perpetuating the problem. That sometimes the intervention might actually be exacerbating, if not perpetuating the issue that they claim to address.
Yeah. Yeah, so the issue of how you get creative disruption in that space, that's a big question.
This is research that would happen before your data collection point, because you're looking at people after separation. Is that correct?
That's right.
Okay, all right. So you're more comfortable speaking to the data about what happens post-separation.
Right? Yeah, that's right. Though we know that often things that occur post-separation have been going on prior to separation, which is why relationships often dissolve.
What kinds of things?
Well, if you looked at the biggies around, what impacts like the darker side of relationships, around poverty, around alcohol and substance abuse, around coercive control, they're the big three things that lead to bad outcomes for kids and for families. And, when relationships go bad, they contort in very strange ways. And I'm sure you know what I mean by that. And most listeners would know someone who witnessed those contortions.
Can you give an example of a contortion? Because I like that use of.
Right. Yeah, well, people who become obsessed and stuck, people who turn to alcohol and drugs or dangerous, risky behavior, looking for some kind of arousal jag to fill the void and give them energy. which is what hatred does, by the way. It gives you a purpose, it gives you meaning, and it gives you energy.
Is it better than indifference, though?
Well, indifference, like, so as you've alluded to, love and hate aren't opposites. The opposite's indifference. If you ask someone who was connected to someone if they could let go and become indifferent, because that would be the ideal. If someone doesn't want to be with you, like, I've got a little mantra in my life, mate, and it's I never want to be where I'm not wanted. Doesn't matter,
Mantra. I like that.
Whether you're on this, whether it's your show or in a relationship or with, in a department at a uni, if I'm not wanted, I don't want to be there. So, indifference is kind of a very powerful thing. But isn't that the rub of life? When do you hold on and when do you let go?
You're reminding me of when I was in my 20s. I was dating a girl, and I just couldn't tell whether or not she wanted to be in a relationship with me. And I took out, but like, I was happy to be there, but I was like, I'm not convinced that she's entirely here with me. So I drew up a box. It was straight out of Stephen R. Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People.
Oh, yeah.
I did my own spin on it, and I drew this box with, along the top was happy, sad, and along the side was happy, sad, and there were 4 boxes. And I said, this is you could be happy or sad, and this is me, I could be happy or sad. This box, we're both happy. This is happy, sad, and this is sad, happy, and this is sad, sad. And I said, which box do you think we're in? And she's like, oh, happy, sad, sad, or like she wanted to commit to a box, which is one of the reasons I like her, because I don't like people who like to pigeonhole themselves. And I said, oh, okay, well, do you want to part ways? And she's like, yeah. And I paid for orange juice and we parted ways. It was so amicable. And I just wish, like, I think there's all this training, particularly in Hollywood for us. And I say Hollywood because there's so much media that we're subject to about how to date, how to make someone fall in love with you, how to fall in love with someone, what's the recipe for a romance. But there's no recipe for breaking up. Where's our recipe for a really good go on.
And when you see a couple who've separated and they spend a lot of time together and they go to the soccer matches with their kids and they barrack for the kids on the same field, and when you see them getting along, people go, what's going on here? That's not normal. That's a bit weird.
Yeah.
When you divorce or separate, there's meant to be a lot of acrimony. There's meant to be this, there's meant to be that. Don't you hate the bitch? What's going on here? So it's kind of a bit sad, really, but interesting.
And then you've got that Gwyneth Paltrow, like you said, sort of like, yeah, the Gwyneth Paltrow is weird. It's like, well, actually, it's kind of a good weird, where she, what does she call it? I mean, she's co-parenting, but it's amicable and parted ways, but they still recognize each other as co-parents. Do you think there should be some training before people have kids about co-parenting?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think Australia, actually, in a lot of places in the world, the whole thing around strengthening relationships has fallen by the wayside. In this disposable world, the normality is around, if something don't work, ditch it. And don't hang in there, and so that's been one of kind of my concerns for a long time around families is, and even in my own relationship, I wish we had more time to couple and to strengthen our relationship, but we struggle. If we can get an hour of TV together a couple of times a week, that's about as good as it gets. And yet I know after 20 years, so much work could be done between us around strengthening our own relationship.
Yeah. Interesting that I like what you're saying about normality has become very takeaway. If it's not satisfying you, get rid of it, buy another one. And it's, no one darns their socks anymore. Everyone just throws them out and buys a new pair.
What's so interesting is that, I hang out with family therapists who are systemic in their practice. And they say sometimes when they sit with families where parents have separated and both parents have repartnered, it's hard to tell the new from the old. Like wow. People repartner with very similar people that they were with.
Wow. Yeah, right. It's funny because normal can become really unhealthy too. Like someone can normalize a very unhealthy relationship very easily, and start to normalize things in a relationship that are these therapists saying that people start to normalize the same things that were unhealthy in the previous relationship?
I think they're just saying that it's just interesting that these patterns kind of, and this gets back to what I said earlier around our families of origin and our upbringing and the things that we kind of crave for, within our family and from our families, and how they can stay with us through life in very powerful ways, Paul.
How can we remedy these patterns that are not necessarily helpful?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a great question. Well, this is kind of what got me into hatred, because I think when you sit with couples and say, oh, you guys are fighting, you're in high conflict, they go, yeah, that's normal. But if you say, hey, Paul, it sounds a bit like the way you're feeling is hatred towards your former partner, all of a sudden it takes things to another level. And this gets back to that creative disruption idea of how do you knock that orbit out? And so some of it, I think, is just actually naming things to tame them, like name it to tame it. So calling out something.
Yeah.
Asking questions. What kind of a dad do you want to be? What kind of a mum do you want to be? How do you want to be remembered? These kind of reflective questions. But gee, normal does feel very comfortable and safe. And this can be a hard dynamic to shake when it feels like it's worked for you, but all of a sudden things aren't working and you're not sure why, but they feel comfortable. I think people say that about OCD. Some of it's just about the comfortability of how something feels when you do it. It just feels right.
Yeah.
It's not good for you when you're counting and checking and cleaning, but it feels right.
And to name it is to tame it. Could you give an example of that?
Well, I think I just gave one with hatred, where you say to someone, it sounds to me like you're feeling hatred here, and might that be the case? And if so, can we talk about hatred and how that might be working for you and your partner and your children?
I know this, at the risk of sounding of gendering the conversation. Do you think that women are equipped through our education system, but also through, well, for me it was 1990s daytime television, growing up on Oprah, gave me a vocabulary to make sense of these things, but not every guy I meet is equipped to have a conversation of this nature, or to name things like that, or equipped to turn around and listen in a way that says, is prepared for the answer when you go, hey, it sounds like you're experiencing hatred. Can you perhaps tell me if that's what you're feeling? And if it's not, can you try and describe it to me? Like, I feel that maybe socially, women are trained better on talking about these things than men are. I think there's a failure of education to equip men with the vocabulary to discuss these things.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right around emotion work and the naming of emotions. But I think if providing you build the right environment, like for a discussion like that you create, I mean, you wouldn't walk straight into it, but you create a safe and supportive environment for people, that you earn people's respect to have those sorts of conversations. And then you put some stuff out there to see if it sticks. It may not stick, but in terms of this disruption, I do think, I mean, the latest area around primary dispute resolution is about talking to kids and relaying what children say and how they feel back to their parents. And that can be a very powerful thing. Parents can actually understand the language of kids because kids see so clearly.
Yeah.
So I think in certain circumstances, whether you're good at emotion work or not, there are some basic truths, simple truths that all of us can hear, Yeah, very much so.
Yeah, right. If I can ask, so you hang around with therapists, but what does your field work look like? You are you having coffee with them? Are you in the room with them and post-separation couples, or?
Yeah. So the data collections involve everything from national random samples, so surveys of 5,000 people, to one-on-one interviews with kids and with their parents.
Wow.
Focus groups. And the project on at the moment, which is, it's funny you mentioned Gwyneth Paltrow, because I've been working with the app that she supports. So we've just run a little lab experiment where we took 10 popular post-separation parenting apps. These are apps that allow you to talk to each other, put in your shared time arrangements, share documents, meant to take some of the conflict out of communication. And so we basically gave these 10 apps to 30 mediators and said, give them a try and see what you think as a usability study. And we're about to run a randomized control trial if we get the funding for that. But basically, lately, we've been getting into this kind of tech stuff, because whether you like it or not, the technology is everywhere within families, with kids, with parents. All of us are, always on, so to speak, especially academics with international collaborators.
30 apps, you said?
10 apps, the 10 most popular apps, with 30 mediators, and we gave them basically about an hour and a half to trial. So we had standardized vignettes. We got them to play parents who were in high conflict relationships. Why didn't we get separated parents to do this? Because it would have been unethical, because we don't know whether these apps actually do reduce conflict or actually cause more conflict by the nature of it.
Because of the way in which the template or
the sorts of things they afford. For instance, if in your tool, whether someone's read something, at one level you go, great, they can't say they didn't see it. At another level, they say they read it, but they haven't responded to me. So these different affordances, I'm sure you've mucked around with affordance theory and the way certain things afford different directions. So where we got to in the end was any feature can be a benefit or a risk, depending on the context.
Yeah.
And so this is where I go back to Chat GPT, because when you're looking at technological fueled abuse, coercive control is a very subtle thing. And people use certain phrases and intonation and language in a way to create fear.
Yeah.
And so these simple word kind of things don't work. But I do think AI, which is kind of where our project's heading next, it's really interesting. And what kind of got me into ChatGPT was there's a framework by a chap called Bill Eddy, which is BIF in communication: brief, informative, friendly, and firm. So whenever we're communicating with each other and we're in conflict, so long as I'm brief, I'm informative, I'm friendly, and I'm firm, we kind of can stop conflict from going into a bad place, So it's a very powerful tool. So one of my friends who's a mediator decided to play with this with ChatGPT. So he took some people's communication and he said, using the BIF approach, how should I respond? And ChatGPT was amazing.
Wow. So advice to post-separation couples out there: get ChatGPT or some other AI engine to rework your communication, your written communication, using the BIF, brief, informative,
friendly, and firm. Yeah.
Rubric. I like that. That's cool.
Yeah, and yet I've tried it, and like you, I'm sure I've put in a couple of student topics to see what would come up, and the rubbish that comes out, it's a fail.
Yeah. It makes such confident mistakes. Just the algorithm that is, which is funny because you're like, wow, that's 100% not true.
Yeah, that's right.
You've just stated that, and it just comes across so convincing and so persuasive in the way that AI has written this paragraph. But I like how we've circled back to AI here, and I like that we're circling back to communication, because it comes back to a question that you asked me earlier, which is, what can appearing normal do? I'm paraphrasing poorly there. AI would be slapping me over my head for my poor memory skills there. But it's interesting how in the forms of communication that you're saying, how people can disguise, let's call it emotional abuse.
Yep.
In otherwise normal language. And I saw a nice example of this the other day where a parent, I was reading an example of it, where a parent can chastise one child for bad marks, but congratulate the other child on good marks. And then in the context of, say, a family dinner, that same parent can say something really nice about the child who has got some good marks, but it appears on the surface like a really nice thing to say, but the absence of mentioning the effort that the other child went to is actually a form of violence towards that child, albeit hidden violence, because on the surface the communication looks normal, but beneath the surface there's a history to that communication that imbues violence into what is left unsaid. And it's interesting that you can use AI to possibly to weed that out of communication, but also to possibly even track or unpack those kinds of forms of coercion, if we can call that a form of coercion.
Yeah. I'm sort of fascinated by, how does time give you a connection with children? Like, how do you use your time with kids? And what are the messages that children take from how you use or don't use that time?
Yeah.
So the communication stuff and the messages it sends, be that, explicit or buried deep in subterfuge, those messages are very powerful, mate.
Yeah. I remember chatting to a co-parent who didn't get a lot of time with their kids. It's gender neutral. Didn't get a lot of time with their kids, and their kids weren't doing a lot of activities and were basically just spending a lot of time in front of some kind of game gear or Xbox or something. And they felt that the best thing that they could do with their time with the kids was take them and do a tennis lesson. And then after doing this for however long they did it, the kids were like, "We just want to spend time with you."
Yeah, that's right.
We don't want to go play tennis. We want to play. We just want to spend time with you.
Yeah.
And it's just such a heartbreaking moment, because here's this parent who just wants to do so much for their kids, and at the end of the day, the kids just want to spend time with that parent that they don't get to see that often, which is
I think that's true of most kids in modern society. I know a dad who used to see his teenage son who played in the band once a week for a couple of hours. Dad would go along with a couple of beers and sit on the floor, give the beers to the older boys. His son was kind of 14. And he would just sit next to his son playing the drums at rehearsal once a week. But the message that sent his son of, I'm interested in you and I care about what you do, was so powerful. Especially when you had to travel for about 3 hours on the train to go and see some gig out in the middle of nowhere.
Wow.
How do we use our time and what messages does it send? It's pretty important. Yep.
Fascinating discussion, and the AI discussion interests me as well, because and perhaps we could wrap up on this question, because I think the way in which we encode normality into law, the way in which we encode normality into government regulations, the way in which we encode normality into our research. I saw this fantastic research which blew my mind recently. I wish I could have had the authors on the tip of my tongue, debunking the whole mother-infant bond, and pointing out that, the mother-infant bond research has been subject to confirmation bias, because it came about in an environment where men were removing themselves from the family, from the nuclear family, and putting themselves at work, and they were simultaneously removing women from the workplace, and pushing them into the home. And so the mother-infant bond research pointed at the mother-infant bond being the primary source of care because of the confirmation bias of the social standards of the day. And it turns out that it's a parent-infant bond. It's not a mother-infant bond. It's a parent-infant bond. And I love this kind of research that really questions the assumptions that are built into things that we assume are normal. And the problem here is that, we've got all this research which is subject to a confirmation bias that reinforces social standards that come from a cisgendered historical background, and then we feed it into some kind of AI. It could be a big data, could be a biobank, could be the algorithms that we use to dissect data, and there's a risk there that the AI algorithms will repeat, perpetuate, or possibly even further entrench
Yeah.
standards that are actually not natural, but are a socially constructed form of normality.
Yeah.
And is this a risk that you foresee happening through AI in some of your interest in AI?
I think it's a real concern, but I think what's so exciting about this whole area is how quickly it's moving. And, apparently this technology's been around for a while, but it's only just kind of come to the fore in the last year or two. But, my colleagues in cyber security and cybernetics, like the speed at which all this stuff's working, it's just breathtaking. So I'm actually quietly excited, but I also feel a little bit overwhelmed about the implications, because I actually don't think we understand the potential risks and harms yet around these potential biases and other things that are going on under the hood.
Absolutely, 100%. Yeah. And as the algorithms become even more advanced, humans are struggling to keep up with where AI's gone as well. The story at Google where people were looking at this language that Google was making up to translate one language to another language, and then they were like, "Whoa, hang on, this has been happening for several months, and we weren't aware of it happening, and we can't decipher it. It's not making sense to human minds when we just look at it. It's going to take us a while to unpack this." Well, what questions, at the risk of glossing over a topic that, and I don't want to do that, but what questions do you think we should ask about the performance of normality? What questions do you think we should ask about the way in which we perform normality in our everyday life or in our family networks?
Well, I know for me, the question is, when is that performance helpful and when is it not helpful?
Yeah, okay. Can it be helpful?
I believe it can be helpful. I think, yeah, very much so. There are places when that performance is helpful, and there are instances when clearly, as you look at your series, your wonderful series, when it's actually not helpful.
Yeah, right. When you're saying that performing normality can be helpful, what does that look like? What's the routine that we're talking about there?
Okay, so in a busy life, there's much to be said in a home for lighting a candle at dinner time, having the table set, and when that candle's lit, everybody knows that you stop what you're doing and you sit down and you eat a meal, and that could be a normal dinner. And I think there's a lot to be said. It's funny, we just finished a study with some colleagues. My colleague Linda Feldberg at Melbourne University, we just interviewed a whole bunch of kids around how do you make a home? What is home to you and how do you make a home? And we asked them, what matters to you in that? And the response they gave us stunned all of us on the team, which was basically the things that matter to them in making a home, making a normal home, is the kitchen table and the couch. And when you think about it, that makes a lot of sense from a child's point of view, because they're sites of connection. But
not the Lego.
Not or the devices or the bandwidth of your internet, or do you know what I mean? It's kind of like, so I think these instances where you're performing normality, and we're both reaching for sociology here, rituals, routines, and the sacred, are very powerful ways in which families do family work.
Yeah. What I hear there, and I'm totally biased in the way I hear it, is constructing some family rituals can be really helpful. Not necessarily constructing normal, but constructing some rituals. I love that. My partner's from a different cultural background, and they pointed out to me that, why is breakfast such a big thing here? And I'm like, there's been decades of marketing to sell us on, high sugar content cereals that make big corporations a lot of money. And even research that has been funded by those big companies to suggest that the nutrition that you get from those cereals and the accompanying milk helps performance. And whereas from a sociological or an anthropological perspective, we might go, well, actually, what they've done is fostered a little bit of a ritual that gets kids out of bed a little bit earlier to spend just a little bit of time with their parents before going to school, rather than everyone just looking after themselves and then getting off to work and not paying attention to each other. You know, buying breakfast cereal, buying something for someone in your family is a nice little ritual. It's like, I'm thinking of you as I buy these Fruit Loops or whatever it is. Don't want to mention any brands, but yeah. Professor Smyth, it's been such a pleasure chatting with you about normality, creative disruption, post-separation families, and you've re-inspired me to revisit more of your research. I don't know if I can revisit more research, but it's an incorrect turn of phrase. But there's certainly a plethora of research there on post-separation conflict and what healthy family life can look like after people become separated co-parents as opposed to married co-parents. Well, thank you for your time.
Thanks, Paul. I loved it, and go well, buddy.